Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Harry Lausaneziris and my chess YouTube channel, grecochess. We are continuing the coverage of the tournament that's taking place at the Queens Chess Club. They call it the Sept-o-ber. And today we're going to present from round number 4 my fourth game at this tournament. But first, let's talk about the tournament itself. Let's share the information. It takes place in Floral Park, New York. It started on September 5th. The first three rounds were the 5th, the 12th, and the 19th. And I already presented my games in previous videos. Now I'm going to present my most recent game from September 26th. And next week, there's going to be the 5th and last round, October 3rd. Time control. It's 5 Swiss rounds, meaning every player expected to play 5 games. And time control is G90 D5. What does this mean? It means that when the game starts, the players have 90 minutes on their clocks. And when it's your turn to play, for the first 5 seconds, the D5, the delay 5, the clock does not move. And then it continues going downwards. And players are expected to complete all of their moves before the clock goes down to 0. Otherwise, they lost because of time. If you've seen my previous videos, I started with a win on round 2, but losses on rounds 1 and 3. So I have 1 out of 3 points. And let's see what we are going to do now on round number 4. But first, let's introduce my opponent. His name is Lucian Zou. His rating officially was 1028, but after his most recent tournaments, it's going to rise to 1108, 1108. Compare this with my number, and he is in the 68.1 percentile. Compare this with my numbers. My rating officially was 1582, October 1st, after my tournaments in Albany, the New York State Championship, and in Jericho, Long Island, for Chesante, it's going to rise to 1609. And my percentile, I'm in the 87th percentile. What does this mean? It means that I'm the favorite, but let's give a look and see what actually happened at the game. Once again, we're using the chessboard from chess.com. On the left half of the screen, you're going to see the chessboard, and I'm going to enter the moves one by one as I'm copying them from the score sheet of the game. On the right half, before the word analysis, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Positive number means white is better on the computer. Negative means that black is better. Computer will show whether a move played was the best or not, and if not, which would have been the best 3 moves. I had the white pieces, and Lucian had the black. I start sending my pawn to e4, and Lucian sends his pawn to e5. My knight goes to f3, and Lucian sends his knight to c6. The Scotch opening, pawn to d4, black will take it, and the Scotch gambit with bishop to c4. Black sends the knight to f6, and I push my pawn to e5. And this is tricky because black better need to know by heart the response. It's very tempting to move the knight from f6 to save it, but the result is usually a disaster. The best reply, and by now I have to say most people know it, even though the internet may say that you may catch it by surprise, is send the pawn to d5. Forget about the knight and attack white's bishop. My bishop goes to b5. Knight goes to e4 for black. And I'm taking the pawn at d4, equalizing material. Until now, we're using theory. And the name of this particular variation is called, this, as you see here, I'm going to read it. The Scots Gambit, Scots game, Scots Gambit, Dubois-Reti advanced variation. Okay. And black responds, Lucian sends his bishop to d7. Another book move, although not very common. I'm going to take the knight to c6. and Lucian will take my knight, my bishop on c6. Finally, we're deviating from theory. Good move, although the computer would prefer if the pawn would take it, because then black would have kept the two bishops. Instead, I'm taking the bishop with my knight. Pawn takes it back, and although material is the same, I have doubled black's pawns on the c file. Still, it's not so terrible because there's also next door the d pawn, so this three can make a little group. But if there is no compensation, it's not a good idea to double your pawns. Let's continue. I castle, short side. And black sends the bishop to c5. Develops the bishop, exerts pressure on f2. For the time being, the pawn on f2 is safe, but because, I mean, if black decides to sacrifice bishop and knight for rook and pawn, even though 6 points in each case, it is better to have the extra pieces than although the difference is very small, it's better to keep to have the knight and the bishop instead of the rook and the pawn. But the pawn cannot move because it's pinned, and the rook cannot move because if the rook goes, for example, to e1, then bishop f2 check and the rook is lost. I have to keep these things in my mind. What will I do now? Change the game. One idea, of course, would be to put the bishop on e3, but after the exchange, I have doubled my pawns on the e file and the isolated double pawns. Instead, I move my queen to g4, attacking the pawn on g7. Inaccuracy says the computer would rather have me push my knight to d2 and go perhaps for an exchange. Black sends the pawn to g6, protects the pawn by sending it to g6. Would rather have the queen go to d7. Now, in case you wonder if a black had castled, I would have sent my bishop to h6. It is pinned, so the pawn cannot take it. I'm threatening with mate. And yes, there are ways for black to avoid the mate, but black will be very much behind. Computer would rather have the queen go to d7. And let's continue. Now I'm moving my knight to d2, which is the best move according to the computer, because I want to change knights. I don't like the knight being on e4, exerting pressure on f2, and being on my half of the board. And Lucian doesn't want to exchange the knights, instead sends the queen to g5, which is protected by the knight on e4, supposedly. And when Lucian played that, I knew what I was going to do because really I could fail the blunder. Of course, I had to double check a few times because if my calculation was wrong, I would be losing. But once I was happy that, satisfied that my calculation was correct, I'm taking the knight, and as you see, my advantage becomes huge now. 4.04, great move. And you're going to see what was so nice. First of all, the queen on g5 is not protected by the knight any longer. If the pawn takes my knight, I win the queen. But black decided to take my queen on g4. Best is a computer. I'm not sure how best is that, and I'll explain why. Because my knight goes to f6, there's a pin against a king, and once the king goes to e7, I get back the queen, and I have an extra piece. The problem with black taking my queen is that after the queens were exchanged, my one-piece advantage becomes much larger. As I have mentioned other times, if you're down in material, you better keep queens on the board because the player that is up may accidentally or by an existing combination lose their queen or lose material. But now I know that there's no chance I may ever gamble a queen. I still have to be very careful, but the game cannot suddenly change dramatically out of a wrong queen misplacement. Now let's see how do we continue. Rook goes to b8 for black. Wants to take my pawn on b2, which basically freezes my bishop. I don't like that, so I'm going to send my rook on b1. King goes to e6 for black, hoping to grab the pawn. Of course, not now because protected by the knight. But if pawn goes to h5 and knight goes away, then black gets won the pawn. And black would like eventually to win 3 pawns. That is the value of a piece, if possible. Can this happen? Let's give a look. My rook goes to e1 to protect the pawn again. And bishop goes to d4 for black. If the bishop takes a pawn, then the rook will take the bishop. But if, for example, black plays h5 and I have to move my knight, then the pawn on e5 may be lost. 18th move for me, and I make a mistake. My pawn goes to c3 because I wanted to kick off the bishop. Inaccuracy is a computer, in fact, it's a mistake. And I realized it once Lucian took my pawn, because then I realized I cannot take back the bishop. That was the threat. Because of the pin, I'm going to lose my rook. Fortunately, I saw it on time. Not only that, my rook on e1 is attacked. I need to save it. I send it to e2. And pawn goes to h5 for black, attacking my knight. I have already lost one pawn. And if I'm not careful and I move my knight, then I'm losing a second pawn, and black needs just one pawn to equalize. My knight goes to e3. And if the black bishop takes my pawn, things may not be so easy. I may move my knight and then attack. If the bishop is still pinned, attack it with my pawn. So Lucian decides to move his rook to d8. We completed the first 20 moves. Let's see how things are going. This was inaccuracy according to the computer. In fact, the computer would rather have have black take my pawn on e5, because then you're going to see that they already took two pawns, and it's not so easy to grab the pawn, to grab the bishop, because if my knight moves anywhere, then the king could go, for example, to f5, and there's no pin any longer, so the attack with f4 would not be valid. We completed 20 moves. After this move that the computer calls inaccuracy, I'm ahead by 3.45. But if one looks carefully, first of all, I have already lost one pawn for the piece, and I'm in danger of losing a second one. And even worse, the d5 pawn is a protected pass pawn. There's no pawn that can block it either in front or from the c or the e files. Of course, there are many pieces, but if pieces were exchanged, there could be a possibility of the pawn going all the way down and promoting. Plus, I still have not solved the back rank problem. My king with 3 pawns in front, so I'd better be careful. The extra piece doesn't mean too much. But let's see how the game continues. Knight goes to d1 and attacks the bishop. Bishop goes to d4 to save itself. In fact, it's at a nice location, in the sense that it's exactly facing the knight with two squares between them. In other words, he controls all four squares where the knight can go. b2, c3, e3, f2. I don't like this, so I want to exchange the bishops. Also, I'm ahead in material. And black obliges. Black doesn't. Maybe they would have taken the pawn. Even the computer thinks exchanging the bishop is the best. And taking the pawn is not even among the top 3 moves. Because what would happen if the bishop goes here, I would send the pawn to f4, and black would either need to take it, then I take on h7 with a discovered check and win the rook, or otherwise or remove it somewhere else. Once again, I have the discovered check and I win the b8 rook. This is why we're exchanging bishops. And pawn goes to d4 for black. Black has the rook on d8, hoping to support the d pawn as it comes near promotion. But let's see how near can it go. Of course, I have to remove my rooks at center attack to a3, send to a3 to attack the pawn on a7. Rook goes to a8 to protect it. Although computer would rather have black give up the pawn and attack the pawn on e5. My pawn goes to f4 to protect the pawn on e5. And black sends the pawn to c5. My rook goes to c1 to attack the pawn. And king goes to d5 to defend it. And my other rook goes to a5. The pawn on c5 is attacked twice, defended once. Not so easy to, I don't think it's even possible to defend it. Of course, the king could go to e4 to attack the pawn at f4. That's what the black actually does. But then I have my pawn going to g3, and I have a nice chain of 4 pawns, h2, g3, f4, and e5. Rook goes to d7 for black to attack the pawn on c7. I take now the pawn on c5, and by taking it, I have the same number of pawns. I still have an extra piece, but I'm not a pawn down like before. Rook goes to c8 for black to defend the c7 pawn. And my knight goes to f2 with a check. The computer would rather have the king go to f3, the first choice, or to e3, the second, but instead sends it to f5. And I have a very strong position. I have almost a mate in 2 moves. If my rook went to c6, next move is to f6 mate, and the only way for black to stop it is if they put the rook on d6, and then I win it with my pawn. So I have either a mate in 2 moves or an extra rook. If only I could see it, and unfortunately I saw it a moment too late, meaning I saw it after I had done my next move, rook to d1 to attack the pawn on d4. It's a miss, I would say. Computer says good, it's a miss at the very minimum. Black sends rook to b8 to attack my pawn on b2. Rook goes to c6 to threaten the mate again. But unlike before, now there is a reply that black can play without losing any material. Rook goes to c6, excuse me, to b6, from b8 to b6. Yes, you don't lose material, but when you're ahead like I am and you exchange pieces, that is a good idea. But before I exchange, let me send my rook to c1, meaning if we exchange rooks, my rook will go to c6 and again threaten with mate. And black tries to postpone it, pawn goes to f6. My rook cannot just go to f6 because black will take it, pawn takes it, king takes the pawn, and I lost the pawn. Instead, I take the rook on b6, and black takes it back with the 8 pawn. I'm still 1 piece ahead, but now there is less material on the board. My only fear is, what are my fears? Of course, if I blunder my rook, if by mistake I take the pawn on c7 and I forget that there was a rook next to that, or if the d pawn somehow can make it to the end, because there is no pawn to its front or to its left or right. There is a knight on f2 that might stop it, but then the rook can take the knight. I still need to be careful. Not so easy, meaning under best play. If I play my best, black cannot win or even get a draw, but I really need to be careful to really play my best. What do? I take the pawn on f6, the second best move according to the computer. Why do I play? The black will take it back with their king. But by doing so, I remove the king a little bit. It goes a little bit backwards. My rook goes to d1 to threaten the pawn on d4. And black wants to defend it by more than just the rook. They send the pawn to c5 and create a chain b6, c5, d4. What I'm afraid is what if these 2 pawns, the C, the D, start going downwards for promotion and each supporting the other and both supported at the back by the rook. To minimize the chance that this can happen, I push my pawn to b3 so the c5, this pawn from c5 cannot just go to c4. But Lucian decides to support it by moving the pawn from b6 to b5 with the idea the next move this goes here, and if we exchange, then Lucian has protected, excuse me, not protected, connected pass pawns, and they can really overwhelm a knight. If Lucian can reach this position with two protected and connected pass pawns, perhaps my knight may not be strong enough, especially if the king approaches my position. So Lucian starts for one moment to hope, but I had seen that this is hopeless because my knight goes to e4 check and it is a fork. Now I'm going to win, no matter where black goes, I'm going to win the pawn at c5, and therefore the dream of having a c pawn protecting the past d4 pawn is vanished. At this moment, Lucian resigned, and of course, to Lucian, I have to congratulate him for playing quite a good game and for fighting until the end. I saw him after the game, and I saw also his mother, told them how good is Lucian, what potential he has. He just needs to be a little bit careful with the Night Fox, get more experience on that. It's very admirable if you see people with low ratings being in these open tournaments and facing players with high ratings, even if they know that their chances are very limited. After this game, I have wins in rounds 2 and 4, losses in rounds 1 and 3. I have 2 points out of 4. But let's see what does the computer have to say in its review of the game. "89.1 accuracy for me, 84.1 for Lucian. Computer thinks that my rating, or my game, in fact, the way I played, corresponds to a rating of 2400 and Lucian's 2200. I need to say it's quite flattering because people with these strong ratings, they play much better than both of us. But let's go to the various categories and see what happened. No brilliant moves. I had 2 great moves. 11 best moves for each of us. Excellent, 12 for me, 11 for Lucian. Good, 3 for me, 6 for Lucian. Book, 8 for me, 7 for Lucian. I had 2 inaccuracies. Lucian had 1 mistake and 1 blunder. And the big blunder, of course, was when the queen moved to g5 and I got the extra piece. This concludes the coverage of the 4th round, but while we still have a few days until round 5, let me share with you what I'm going to present during the next days, because we have something very exciting going on. It is the grecochess tournament at chess.com. 16 players participate in 4 groups of 4. From every group, the top player advances, and these 4 players will play in a final round. I believe if there is a tie and more than 4 advance, we might have 2 semi-final rounds. From my next video, I'll start presenting the games that have been completed. How's the situation going? The grecochess tournament of chess.com. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to the viewers, the subscribers, and also to people that have left some nice comments. I'm Charelos Aniziris. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.